Welcome back. In this video, I finish out the cowl area and get this upper cowl installed, welded in, and ground flat and looking great, which is good because I am just about out of cowl puns. Okay, now that I have the lower cowl in place, the next steps are going to be prepping this lower cowl to receive the upper cowl on top of it, and prepping the upper cowl to get welded in. So we'll start over here. The prepping on this side is going to be honestly very similar to the lower one. I'm gonna mask off where I'm going to be welding, and on this one it's got top, both sides, and then back here to the dash, and then here to the lower cowl. So I'm gonna mask off kind of all the spots where I know it's going to be welded, and then prep it and do a coat of the rust encapsulator. You know, again, came treated from the factory with their weld through primer, which, as we've seen on the roof that's been sitting for years and years, holds up pretty well. Is potentially overkill, but I don't care. So I'm going to go ahead and prep that, drill all the holes for plug welding. So this is going to be very similar to what I did on the lower one. All right, that is most of my holes drilled. I started off, actually stepped it up 4 different times, going from a very small pilot hole all the way up to 5/16 of an inch. I found that it is honestly quicker to do multiple quick little cuts that save your drill bits, and than it is to step up from like a 1/16 to 5/16. That just burns up your drill bits, and you wind up spending more time doing that in the long run. You could also use a step drill bit. I've seen a couple of spot weld cutters that were 5/16. If you can, most of them are 3/8, but if you can find some 5/16 ones, that makes really quick work of sheet metal. Anyway, there's multiple ways to skin this cat. I just chose to alternate 2 different drill motors that I had and just step it up. It's about as quick as any other method. One exception that I can go ahead and show you is this back flange here is not very wide. And there's spots, especially towards the end, where it tapers down. This is one of my stepping up bits. So let me show you. Here's that 5/16 bit, and out at the end, if I were to make these 5/16, that's not a ton of room left to weld. And I ran into the same thing doing the roof. In between the side of the roof and the rain gutter, actually made a smaller hole. So I'm looking, this is a few 16ths smaller. I'm sure you metric folks are laughing at us right now. This is 9/32. I might go ahead and step to that big, and that should be good enough, wide enough to weld, but not so wide that I've got essentially no sidewall left there. So, yeah. All right, forgive the background noise. I've got all of the welds drilled around the perimeter, and this back row here goes to the dash. Now, one thing that I'm a little hesitant, we'll say, about is if I move this here, well, let me move this out of the way and show you. The top row, that top row welds to the back, or I guess the front edge of the dash here. There's another row that goes to the lower cowl here, kind of right where my shadow is. So you've got 2 weld points here and here. Now, because I mounted this separately and mounted it up, I don't know how close that is to touching the upper cowl where it's supposed to weld to here. Ideally, this piece right here and that piece right there are flush against each other, but I can't confirm that until I actually drill a hole and measure it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drill probably just a couple of test holes, maybe one a quarter of the way, one in the middle, and one another quarter of the way. I know it's touching at the edge because it's right there and I can see it. But in the middle, I want to see if this is, well, I mean, this is going to not be bowed out because it's going to be up against the dash lip here, if you will. But possibly the lower cowl is a little flat and isn't coming up to meet. So interesting point. I'm going to go ahead and drill a couple holes and see if I can measure the depth with the caliper. Keeping in mind, I still have some spots where it's not perfectly flush and we'll need a little bit of a make fit. All right, let me see if I can show you what I'm looking at here. Keep in mind, I haven't cleaned up any of the flashing from these holes, so nothing's going to fit perfectly flush. That being said, this is one of 3 holes that I just drilled. I made them wide enough for my little caliper depth gauge to go down in there. I don't think I need it. So let me see if I can zoom in and show you the results here. Ooh, a little too close. Okay, so I don't know if you can see inside that little hole there, but if I push this in place, there's the metal it's welding to right there. And in hindsight, I was worried about this lip not pulling onto there. I think that's happening because it's hitting the lower cowl, not because it's misshapen or anything. So when I pinch this together, I think the gap closes, and with clamps it definitely closes. I think that's actually just going to push it a little closer to the lower cowl, and the holes that I make here are going to mate up just fine. I need to be careful for these little clips, the trim clips I think they are, where your little chrome trim goes. I don't want to go, well, A, get too close to them and then have to grind back right next to them, which I think I already kind of did on the edges here, so that'll be fun. So the next thing I'm going to do is probably set the cowl just in place where I think it's going to go, position it where it needs to go, clamp it, and then take just a pencil and mark where this is. So I know I've got a good depth. I don't know, do I want to err on the side of further this way or further towards the back edge to land nicely on that lower cowl flange. I don't want to be, right on the edge of it. And I have some control of where I drill these holes to land as close to center as possible. Okay, right now the upper cowl's just sitting there, but I wanted to show you. I got all these holes drilled. Look at that, right? As soon as I press down on this flange to line up the back surface, these all, sorry, I keep getting the shadow in the way, these all go right to the underneath metal. I'm pretty thrilled with that. Just because it's something I couldn't see, I was a little concerned about it, but yeah, pretty happy with how that's shaping up. All right, I'm back in the garage. You can see the upper and lower cowl. I masked off where the weld landing spots would be, or surfaces, and got my rust encapsulator in there. Okay, I'm using Eastwood's brushable seam sealer here. Just a order of operations thing here. So ideally today I'm going to get this on, prep everything, get this welded. I'm going to err on the side of doing this first, simply because I don't want to have this be the last thing right before welding. It does say flammable liquids and vapor. Contents may catch fire. So that doesn't sound like a good thing to weld next to while it's still wet. So I'm going to start the day with putting this on and give it as much time to set up as possible while I go and, grind down welds and prep surfaces and, work on this upper cowl and just kind of get everything fit, etc. So that hopefully will, by the time I get welding, maybe this afternoon, it's going to not catch fire inside my new cowl. The seam sealer in here, I've got acid brushes that still haven't arrived. I'm gonna take an old sacrificial cheapy paintbrush and cut it down. It doesn't need to be pretty in here. It's gonna be inside the cowl, but I'm gonna basically cut this down to make a nice little chip brush, if you will, and use this around the inside. See how messy that gets. I've still got a few of these welds to grind down and just prep this surface and probably put a dusting of weld through primer on there. And then hopefully we're going to be ready to weld in the top of the cowl. Okay, we've got clamps all along the back and got it tightened up here at the front where the export braces go. Clamps in the front corners just to make sure that that lays flat. I talked about this before in other videos, but this section right in here, this bend, didn't align with the lower cowl. I wasn't worried about it, and I'm still not worried about it. Let me kind of show you what I've done. So I got it laying where it needs to be back here, a little tapping, a little clamping to make sure that, both of these surfaces lay flush against each other. And then what I've been doing is just taking a little body hammer and making this curve kind of flatten out. And as I do that, I'm pushing this end into that corner and then flattening this sharper edge so it kind of lays onto the lower cowl. And what that does is that brings, it's gonna be hard to see, but that brings these holes closer. So what I'm gonna do is just kind of finish here. The other side's looking really good. I'm gonna finish kind of massaging these and get a nice transition into the slightly crisper line there. Okay, I got all the landing spots of the upper cowl with some weld through primer. I'm gonna go ahead and put the upper cowl on here, and similar to what I've done in the past, use a little lacquer thinner and a Q-tip and clean up the holes just so I can weld directly to bare metal. Also got the seam sealer all around the hats and dust as well. No biggie. So I'll probably just go ahead and blow this out. I mean, it's gonna be just fine. So I also have the upper prepped. I'm not worried about the overspray. I just used a piece of cardboard and so it didn't get everywhere, but a little overspray of weld through primer on the on top of the rust encapsulator isn't going to hurt a darn thing, and no one's going to see it. And hey, hopefully no one sees this for a long time. Hey, I want to play a fun game. Between the upper and lower cowl, how many spot welds or plug welds did I put in here? Feel free to count if you want, but I'm thinking Price is Right rules, closest without going over, and the grand prize is nothing. All right, except for the welds at the back going to the lower cowl, this upper cowl is in place. I am super stoked. And this is pre-grinding, obviously, except for a few, like there's one that got spattery on me and I had to go back over. I mean, it's not my best work, but it's far from my worst. These are mostly flat welds. I'm gonna go grind for, I don't know, about 6 hours and go back and fill in any gaps that I missed. There's probably a gap, just to make sure everything is nice and flush. You might be able to see in the time lapse, I went ahead and I was alternating between using a grinding disc and using my air tools. So 4.5, 5-inch grinder back and forth and moving around to various spots on the cowl for a couple of reasons. The grinding and sanding builds up a surprising amount of heat in the metal. So just to discourage warping, I'm moving around. Also, I'm kind of hunched over. It's not an ideal work height. So just to keep my back happy, I'm moving around and getting into different positions as I do this, just so I don't, throw out my back or do something silly, just kind of with the repetitive motion. You can see I used I didn't go with self-etch primer, just because I plan to epoxy prime everything once I'm done with metal. So self-etch, I've heard you can have a reaction with the acid in the self-etch. So I just went with a basic sandable automotive primer, not a self-etch primer, which should be just fine. And you might notice these front, although everything's aligned right, these front excess flashing, I don't know what we call them, excess on the stampings, stick out at different levels. So what I'll probably do is go back and trim up so they don't look so jagged in the engine bay, but that is the least of my concerns. And someone has an exhaust going on out there. So I only had a couple of spots, I think it was 4 total, where my weld didn't go all the way around the perimeter, so I touched up and just ground flat. It was a little bit of a challenge getting in this trench here, where I couldn't get a nice angle on it. I had to use a grinding wheel on edge and just kind of get it as flat as I could. I'll double check. I think this is where there's a gasket that goes here all along this channel. If not, there's a few spots where it's not perfectly flat. You can kind of see some of the shadows. It's great for the most part, but anything that's going to be kind of exposed and visible, if it's not great, I'll just do a light bit of a filler before we move on to paint. But that is way down the road. All right, guys, there it is. Everything welded, all my welds ground flat and primed where I did all the grinding and all that fun stuff. I am super stoked. This came out way better than I would have expected. Yeah, not to be disparaging of myself, but anytime you do something new, it's always kind of hit or miss. A lot of well, some trial and error, and probably some things I'll need to go back and touch up. But there it is. It's in place. It's all solid, and I am so happy. Moving forward, there's a couple of other sheet metal projects left. It's probably hard to see, but I've got the two sides of the floor, basically 1.5 floor pans to install in there. And I also have this lovely hole in the front fender apron where the battery goes. I've got a replacement apron there, but I'm not going to use all of it, and we'll get into why in a future video. All right, if you're still with me, thank you so much for watching, and lots more to come.